Certain numbers appear too often to be accidental. Across unrelated systems, the same ratios emerge, the same intervals repeat, the same proportions govern, and the recurrence is not confined to one domain. It appears in physics, in biology, in geometry, in systems that have no apparent connection to each other. And when a pattern repeats across disconnected contexts, the pattern is not contextual, the pattern is structural. It is a property of how systems organize, not a property of what the systems contain. Tesla observed this long before the terminology existed to describe it. He noticed that certain numerical relationships appeared consistently in energy systems, that specific ratios produced stability, while others produced oscillation or collapse. And the ratios were not arbitrary, they were precise, and precision that repeats is not coincidence. Precision that repeats is law, and law is what governs outcome regardless of belief, regardless of intention, regardless of awareness. The law operates, and among the patterns that operate most consistently, 3 numbers recur with frequency that demands explanation. 3, 6, 9, not as symbols, as structural positions, as organizing checkpoints in systems that stabilize themselves without external intervention. The promise here is not mysticism. The promise is structure. Structure that can be observed. Structure that can be tested. Structure that produces predictable results when the conditions are correct. Tesla did not romanticize numbers. He observed their behavior. He noticed that when systems organized naturally, certain ratios appeared without being designed, that oscillations returned to specific intervals, that cycles completed at predictable points, and the predictability was not imposed. The predictability emerged, and emergence is not magic. Emergence is the natural consequence of forces operating under constraint, and constraint is what produces pattern. Without constraint, forces disperse randomly. With constraint, forces organize into repeating structures, and repeating structures are what allow systems to function across time, to maintain coherence across cycles, to produce outcomes that do not degrade with repetition. And non-degrading repetition is what separates stable systems from unstable ones. Stable systems return to baseline, unstable systems drift, and drift is always directional, and the direction is always toward collapse unless the system contains a mechanism for reset. And reset is what 369 describes, not as philosophy, as function. 369 is not a code that unlocks hidden power. 369 is a description of how systems organize themselves when left to natural law. 3 represents initiation, the moment when undifferentiated potential organizes into direction. Not beginning, but the structural threshold where pattern becomes detectable. 6 represents balance, the point where opposing forces equalize into sustainable ratio. Not equilibrium as stillness, but equilibrium as dynamic stability. Forces remain active but proportional. 9 represents completion, the closure of a cycle in a way that allows the cycle to repeat without carrying forward distortion from the previous iteration. Not ending, but integration, the point where accumulated deviation is corrected and the system returns to baseline. And baseline is not rest. Baseline is the configuration from which the next cycle can begin without inheriting instability from the last. And systems that cannot return to baseline accumulate error. And accumulated error is what produces the breakdowns that feel catastrophic but were mathematically certain from the moment deviation began compounding. Tesla noticed that systems which could not reset degraded predictably. That oscillations which could not return to baseline became chaotic. That cycles which could not complete cleanly carried distortion forward into subsequent iterations. And distortion that carries forward does not remain small. Distortion amplifies. And amplified distortion is what most people experience as interference, as the sensation that something is wrong but the source cannot be identified. And the source is always structural. It is always the absence of a reset mechanism, the absence of a point in the cycle where deviation is corrected before the next cycle begins. And correction at 9 is what prevents collapse at 12. But most systems do not reach 9. Most systems operate in incomplete cycles. They initiate at 3, they attempt balance at 6, but they do not complete at 9. They extend past 9 without integrating. An extension without integration is continuation without correction, and continuation without correction is guaranteed drift. And drift is not neutral, drift is directional, and the direction is always away from the intended outcome. The recurrence of 369 across systems that have no apparent relationship suggests that the pattern is not system-specific. The pattern is universal. It is a property of how complexity organizes from simplicity, how order emerges from chaos, how cycles stabilize across repetitions. And stabilization across repetitions is not automatic. Stabilization requires specific structural conditions. Conditions that allow deviation to be detected, conditions that allow correction to occur, conditions that allow the system to return to a state where the next cycle can begin without inheriting instability. And those conditions are proportional, they are ratios. And the ratios that appear most consistently are 369. Not because 369 are special numbers, but because 369 represent the minimum structural complexity required for a system to self-correct. 3 allows pattern recognition, 6 allows force balance, 9 allows cycle completion, and cycle completion is what allows repetition without degradation. And repetition without degradation is what allows systems to persist. And persistence is not survival through force. Persistence is survival through structure. And structure is always proportion, always ratio, always the relationship between elements expressed as numbers. How often do your efforts fail to complete? This is not a question of morality. This is a question of structure. If the cycles you initiate do not reach completion, the energy invested does not return to baseline. It carries forward as unresolved tension, as incomplete pattern, as deviation that will compound in the next cycle. And compounding deviation is what produces the sensation that progress is being made, but outcomes are not appearing, because progress is being made. But the progress is not completing. It is accumulating without integrating. And accumulation without integration is not growth. Accumulation without integration is congestion. It is energy trapped in incomplete cycles. Energy that cannot be released because the cycle never closed. Energy that cannot be reused because it was never returned to baseline. And energy that cannot be reused is energy that becomes unavailable. And unavailable energy is what most people describe as depletion, as the feeling that they are working harder for less result. But the result is not less because the effort is insufficient. The result is less because the cycles are incomplete. And incomplete cycles do not produce outcomes. Incomplete cycles produce interference. Tesla observed that interference was not random noise. Interference was structured noise. It was the result of oscillations that had not returned to baseline, of cycles that had extended past their natural completion point, of systems that were operating in a state of continuous initiation without ever reaching integration. And continuous initiation without integration is exhausting. Not physically exhausting, though physical exhaustion often follows, structurally exhausting. It is the depletion that comes from starting cycles that never finish, from investing energy that never returns, from building structures that never stabilize. And instability is not just the absence of stability. Instability is active degradation. It is the progressive loss of coherence, the slow drift toward states where function becomes impossible, where even basic operation requires extraordinary effort, where maintenance consumes more energy than output produces. And when maintenance consumes more than output produces, the system is not sustainable. It is operating on reserves, and reserves are finite, and finite reserves deplete, and depleted reserves produce collapse. The recurrence of 369 is observable in systems that do not collapse, in structures that persist across time, in cycles that repeat without degrading. And the repetition is not miraculous. The repetition is mechanical. It is the natural outcome of forces operating within proportions that allow reset, that allow deviation to be corrected before it compounds, that allow each cycle to begin from a stable baseline rather than from the unstable endpoint of the previous cycle. And stable baselines are what produce stable outcomes, not identical outcomes, but outcomes that remain within predictable ranges, outcomes that do not drift, outcomes that do not degrade, outcomes that compound constructively rather than destructively. And constructive compounding is what produces the results that appear exponential, that seem to require less effort over time, that feel effortless once the structure is correct. But the effortlessness is not the absence of work. The effortlessness is the presence of structure, structure that allows work to accumulate rather than dissipate, structure that allows cycles to complete rather than abort, structure that allows systems to reset rather than drift. 369 is not the answer to every question. 369 is the structural framework within which answers can be found. It is the recognition that systems organize through initiation, balance, and completion, that these are not sequential steps, but interdependent conditions, that all three must be present for a system to function sustainably. And sustainable function is not permanent function. Sustainable function is function that can repeat without degrading, that can adapt without losing coherence, that can scale without collapsing. And scale is what most people pursue. Scale is the amplification of outcome. But scale without structure is amplification of instability. It is growth that produces collapse, expansion that produces fragmentation, increase that produces decrease. And the decrease is not immediate. The decrease is delayed. It appears after the growth has already occurred, after the expansion has already been celebrated, after the increase has already been counted as success. And delayed collapse is why most people do not connect growth to failure. They see them as unrelated events, but they are not unrelated. They are structurally connected. Growth without completion produces instability, and instability given time produces collapse. And time is not the cause of collapse. Time is the multiplier. It amplifies what is already present, and what is already present is either structure or deviation. And deviation, when multiplied, becomes catastrophic. At this stage, the pattern is visible, but visibility alone does not explain why coincidence fails as explanation. Coincidence is the explanation people use when pattern is noticed, but structure is not understood. When the same result appears twice, coincidence is plausible. When it appears 3 times, coincidence is questionable. When it appears across hundreds of unrelated systems, coincidence is not explanation. Coincidence is evasion. It is the refusal to acknowledge that repetition at scale is not accident. It is law, and law does not require belief. Law operates whether recognized or not, whether accepted or not, whether explained or not. Tesla did not rely on coincidence to explain recurring ratios in electrical systems. He observed that the same proportions appeared regardless of material, regardless of configuration, regardless of scale, and when the same proportion appears regardless of variables, the proportion is not variable dependent. The proportion is structural. It is a property of how energy organizes when allowed to stabilize naturally. And natural stabilization is not random. Natural stabilization follows paths of least resistance, and paths of least resistance are determined by proportion, by the ratios that allow forces to balance without canceling, by the intervals that allow oscillation to return to baseline without overshoot or undershoot. And overshoot and undershoot are deviations, and deviations compound. Randomness fails as explanation when consistency exceeds probability. When 369 appear in biological growth patterns, in geometric progressions, in wave mechanics, in atomic structures, and in dozens of other domains that share no causal relationship, randomness is no longer a viable explanation. Randomness predicts distribution. Randomness predicts that patterns will scatter, that repetition will be rare, that the same numbers will not appear with higher frequency than all others combined. But 369 do appear with higher frequency, not slightly higher, dramatically higher. And dramatically higher frequency is not noise. Dramatically higher frequency is signal, and signal is information. Information about how systems prefer to organize, about what proportions produce stability, about which ratios allow cycles to complete without carrying forward error. And error that is not carried forward does not accumulate, and error that does not accumulate does not produce drift. And systems that do not drift do not require constant correction. They require only that the initial proportion be maintained. And maintained proportion is what 369 describes, not as numbers, as checkpoints. Coincidence assumes independence. It assumes that each occurrence is unrelated to the others, that the appearance of 3 in one system has no connection to the appearance of 3 in another system. But independence is falsified when underlying mechanism is shared, and the underlying mechanism is always proportion. 3 appears because 3 is the minimum complexity required for self-reference, for a system to observe its own state, for pattern to become detectable. 6 appears because 6 is the ratio at which opposing forces can coexist without one dominating, without one consuming the other, without oscillation degrading into chaos. 9 appears because 9 is the point at which accumulated deviation must be corrected or carried forward. And carrying deviation forward is carrying instability forward, and carried instability amplifies. It does not remain constant. It does not decrease on its own. It amplifies until correction is forced, and forced correction is always more disruptive than voluntary correction, because forced correction occurs after the deviation has already compounded past the point where small adjustments suffice. Tesla observed that systems which operated outside these proportions required external energy to maintain stability, that they could not self-sustain, that they degraded predictably when external support was withdrawn, and degradation when support is withdrawn is proof that the system was not structurally sound, that it was being held in place by force rather than maintained by proportion, and force is temporary. Force depletes. Force requires constant renewal. But proportion does not deplete. Proportion is structural. Once established, proportion maintains itself, not through energy input, but through the absence of interference. And interference is what occurs when proportion is violated, when cycles extend past 9 without resetting, when forces unbalance past 6 without correcting, when patterns initiate at 3 but never reach 6 or 9, and patterns that never reach 6 never stabilize, and patterns that never reach 9 never complete, and patterns that never complete never release the energy they consumed, and unreleased energy becomes trapped, and trapped energy is not neutral. Trapped energy produces pressure, and pressure when sustained produces rupture. Why do most failures occur, not at initiation but at points of transition? Because transition is where proportion is tested. Initiation at 3 requires only that pattern emerge. But transition to 6 requires that opposing forces find balance. And balance is not compromise. Balance is the exact ratio where forces neutralize into coherence without losing their individual properties. And finding that ratio is not automatic. Finding that ratio requires precision, and precision requires observation. And observation requires that you see the forces clearly, not as you wish them to be, but as they are. And most people do not see forces as they are. Most people see forces through interpretation, through preference, through the belief that certain forces should dominate and others should submit. But dominance is not balance. Dominance is suppression, and suppression does not produce stability. Suppression produces latent opposition, opposition that remains active beneath the surface, opposition that will reassert itself the moment suppression weakens. And suppression always weakens, because suppression is force, and force depletes. Randomness cannot account for the fact that systems which honor 369 persist while systems which violate 369 collapse. This is not correlation, this is causation. The structure determines the outcome, not the intention, not the effort, the structure. And structure is proportion, and proportion is ratio, and ratio is number, and number is not symbol. Number is relationship. It is the expression of how one element relates to another, how one force balances another, how one cycle integrates into the next. And integration is not automatic. Integration requires that the cycle reach 9, that it complete fully, that it return to baseline before the next cycle begins. And baseline is not starting point. Baseline is stable state, the configuration from which the system can operate without inheriting instability from previous cycles. And systems that cannot return to baseline accumulate instability. And accumulated instability is what produces the breakdowns that appear sudden but were building incrementally across every incomplete cycle. Coincidence also fails to explain why deviation from 369 produces predictable forms of collapse. If the numbers were arbitrary, deviation would produce random outcomes. But deviation does not produce random outcomes. Deviation produces specific outcomes. Systems that initiate but do not reach 6 oscillate indefinitely. They move between extremes without stabilizing. They consume energy without producing coherent output. They generate heat without work, and heat is waste. Systems that reach 6 but do not reach 9 stabilize temporarily but cannot adapt. They become rigid. They resist change. They function only as long as conditions remain static, and static conditions are rare. Conditions evolve, and systems that cannot evolve collapse when conditions change. Systems that skip 9 entirely operate in continuous extension. They never reset. They never correct. They accumulate deviation across cycles until the deviation becomes too large to sustain. And unsustainable systems do not fail gradually. They fail catastrophically. And catastrophic failure is not punishment. Catastrophic failure is mathematics. It is the predictable outcome of compounded deviation. Tesla did not invent 369. He recognized 369. He saw that the ratios were already present, that they were governing systems before he observed them, that his observation did not create the pattern. His observation revealed the pattern, and revelation is not creation. Revelation is recognition. It is seeing what was always there, but was obscured by the belief that complexity requires complex explanation. But complexity does not require complex explanation. Complexity requires precise explanation, and precision is what 369 provides. Precision in how cycles initiate, precision in how forces balance, precision in how systems complete. And completion is not ending. Completion is the return to coherence, the restoration of baseline, the elimination of accumulated deviation, so that the next cycle can begin without carrying forward the instability of the last. And cycles that do not carry forward instability can repeat indefinitely, not identically but coherently. And coherent repetition is what allows systems to persist, to adapt, to scale. And scale without structure is expansion toward collapse, but scale with structure is growth toward stability. Randomness fails because the numbers do not scatter. They concentrate. They appear at specific intervals with frequency that exceeds chance by orders of magnitude. And orders of magnitude is not subtle preference. Orders of magnitude is structural dominance. It is the evidence that the system is not neutral about proportion, that certain ratios produce outcomes the system can sustain, and other ratios produce outcomes the system cannot sustain. And unsustainable outcomes do not persist. They collapse, and collapse clears the system. It removes the configuration that violated proportion, and once removed, the system reorganizes, and reorganization follows the same proportions. 369. Not because the system learned, because the system has no other stable configuration. And stability is not optional for systems that persist. Stability is mandatory. And mandatory stability is produced only by proportions that allow self-correction. And self-correction requires 369. 3 to recognize deviation, 6 to balance forces, 9 to reset baseline. And reset baseline is what allows the next cycle to begin, without inheriting the errors of the last. Coincidence collapses under the weight of consistency. Consistency at this scale is not accident. Consistency at this scale is law, and law does not negotiate. Law does not make exceptions. Law simply operates. and operation produces outcomes that correspond to structure. And structure is either aligned with 369 or misaligned. And misalignment is not permanent. Misalignment is temporary. Because misaligned systems do not persist, they collapse. And collapse is correction. It is the forced return to proportions that allow stability. And stability is the only state worth inhabiting. Not because stability is comfortable, because stability is sustainable. And sustainable is the only configuration that allows continuation. And continuation is not the goal. Coherent continuation is the goal. Continuation that does not degrade. Continuation that does not accumulate error. Continuation that can repeat without collapsing. And repetition without collapse is what 369 makes possible. What remains is not why the pattern repeats, but how Tesla observed it without the framework to name it. Tesla did not theorize about numbers. He observed systems. He watched how electrical current behaved when resistance varied. He measured how oscillations stabilized when certain ratios were maintained. He noticed that mechanical resonance occurred at specific intervals regardless of material or scale, and the intervals were not arbitrary. They repeated, and repetition that is precise is not preference. Repetition that is precise is law. Tesla did not name these intervals as 369. He recognized them as proportional relationships, as ratios that appeared consistently in systems that organized naturally, in circuits that stabilized without external regulation, in oscillators that returned to baseline without damping, in structures that distributed stress without fracturing. And distribution without fracture requires that forces balance, and balance requires proportion, and proportion is expressed as number, and the numbers that appeared most frequently were divisible by 3, or summed to 3, or reduced to 3 through iteration, not because 3 is mystical, because 3 is structural. He observed that systems which operated at frequencies divisible by 3 exhibited lower resistance, that energy flowed more efficiently, that losses due to heat decreased, that output increased for the same input, and increased output for the same input is efficiency. And efficiency is not luck. Efficiency is alignment. Alignment between the structure and the law governing how energy moves. And energy does not move randomly. Energy moves along paths of least resistance. And paths of least resistance are determined by proportion, by the ratios that allow forces to flow without opposition, without friction, without conversion of work into waste. And waste is what occurs when proportion is violated, when the ratio is incorrect, when the structure does not match the natural tendency of the system. And natural tendency is not preference. Natural tendency is the configuration toward which the system moves, when external force is absent. And the configuration is always proportional, and the proportion is always related to 369. Tesla noticed that when he designed circuits with component ratios that aligned with these proportions, the circuits self-corrected. Small deviations did not compound. Oscillations returned to baseline. Output remained stable across temperature changes, across load variations, across time, and stability across variables is proof that the structure is sound, that it is not dependent on ideal conditions, that it can function in the real world where conditions are never ideal, where variables drift, where interference is constant, and constant interference does not destabilize systems that are structurally sound. Constant interference destabilizes systems that are held together by force, by compensation, by continuous external adjustment. And continuous adjustment is evidence that the underlying proportion is incorrect, that the system is operating outside the ratios that allow natural stability. And natural stability is the only stability that lasts, because natural stability does not require energy to maintain. Natural stability is maintained by structure, and structure is proportion, and proportion, when correct, is self-enforcing. He did not publish findings about 369 as mystical code. He embedded the understanding in his designs, in the ratios he chose for coil windings, in the frequencies he selected for alternating current, in the proportions he maintained between components. And the proportions worked, not because they were believed, because they were accurate. Accurate to the structural requirements of the system, accurate to the ratios that allowed energy to organize without resistance, accurate to the intervals that allowed oscillation to return to baseline without overshoot. And overshoot is deviation, and deviation, when uncorrected, compounds into instability, and instability, when sustained, produces collapse. Tesla did not prevent collapse through monitoring. He prevented collapse through design, through the selection of proportions that made collapse structurally impossible. And structural impossibility is the only guarantee, because structural impossibility does not depend on vigilance. It depends on ratio, and ratio, once set correctly, does not drift unless interference is introduced. And interference is always external. It is always the violation of proportion through the addition or removal of elements that disrupt the balance. Why did Tesla repeat certain numbers in his routines obsessively? Not because of superstition, because he recognized that repetition at specific intervals reinforced structural coherence, that actions repeated in multiples of 3 created rhythm, and rhythm is pattern made temporal. It is the expression of proportion across time rather than space, and proportion across time functions identically to proportion across space. It stabilizes, it reduces friction, it allows the system to operate with less resistance. And less resistance means more output for the same input. And more output for the same input is what everyone seeks but most never achieve, because they seek it through intensity, through force, through the belief that more effort will overcome structural misalignment. But effort does not overcome structure. Effort is amplified or wasted by structure. And structure is either aligned or misaligned. And alignment is always proportional. And proportion is always numerical. And the numbers that govern proportion are 3, 6, 9. Tesla observed that natural systems do not require instruction to organize around these ratios. Crystals form at angles divisible by 3. Biological growth follows spiral patterns that resolve to these proportions. Planetary orbits stabilize at intervals that reflect these relationships. And the systems have no awareness. They have no intention. They simply organize according to the proportions that allow stability. And stability is the configuration that minimizes energy expenditure while maximizing structural integrity. And minimizing energy while maximizing integrity is efficiency at the most fundamental level. It is not optimization through trial. It is optimization through law, through the recognition that certain proportions work and other proportions do not. And work is not subjective. Work is measurable. It is force applied through distance. And distance is only traversed when force is not cancelled by opposition. And opposition is minimized when proportion is correct. And correct proportion is 3, 6, 9. He noticed that interference patterns in wave mechanics produce nodes at intervals consistent with these ratios. That standing waves stabilized at frequencies where the wavelength divided evenly into the medium. That resonance occurred when the driving frequency matched the natural frequency of the system. And natural frequency is not arbitrary. Natural frequency is determined by the physical properties of the system and the proportions between those properties. And the proportions that produce resonance are always related to 3, 6, 9, not as external code applied to the system, as internal structure revealed by the system. The system is not obeying 3, 6, 9. The system is expressing 3, 6, 9, because 3, 6, 9 is the structure the system has, and structure determines behavior, always, without exception, and behavior that does not align with structure is behavior that produces resistance, and resistance is what you feel as difficulty, as the sensation that the system is fighting you. But the system is not fighting you. The system is responding to proportion, and if the proportion is incorrect, the response is resistance. Tesla's observation was not theoretical, it was practical. He built machines that functioned, that produced output, that operated reliably across conditions. And reliability is not accident. Reliability is the result of structure that accounts for variation, that allows the system to self-correct when variables drift, that maintains proportion even when individual components degrade. and self-correction is only possible in systems that have reference points, points where the system can compare current state to baseline state and adjust, and the reference points are 3, 6, 9. 3 is where pattern becomes detectable, 6 is where forces balance, 9 is where the cycle completes and the system returns to baseline, and return to baseline is what allows the next cycle to begin without inheriting instability, and cycles that do not inherit instability can repeat indefinitely, and indefinite repetition is what allows systems to persist, to function across time, to produce outcomes that compound constructively rather than destructively. He did not evangelize about the numbers. He used them, and use is the only test that matters. Belief is irrelevant, intention is irrelevant, only structure matters, and structure is proven through outcome. And outcome, when the structure is correct, is predictable, not identical, but within range. And predictable range is what allows design, allows planning, allows the construction of systems that function as intended rather than systems that function accidentally. An accidental function is not repeatable. Accidental function is coincidence, and coincidence is not structure. Coincidence is noise, and noise does not produce signal. Signal is pattern, and pattern is proportion, and proportion is 3, 6, 9. Not as belief, as fact, as observable, testable, repeatable fact. And repeatable fact is law, and law is what governs outcome regardless of awareness. Tesla's framework was not mystical because it was not interpretive. It was observational. He saw what worked. He measured what failed. He adjusted ratios until the system stabilized. And stabilization was not guesswork. Stabilization was the result of proportion aligning with natural law. And natural law does not care about Tesla. Natural law does not care about intention. Natural law operates. An operation produces outcomes that correspond to structure. And structure that corresponds to 3, 6, 9 produces outcomes that are stable, efficient, and repeatable. And outcomes that are stable, efficient, and repeatable are the only outcomes worth pursuing, because unstable outcomes collapse, inefficient outcomes waste, and unrepeatable outcomes are accidents. And accidents do not scale. Accidents do not persist. Accidents do not allow the construction of systems that function across time, and function across time is the only function that matters. The question is no longer whether Tesla observed these ratios, but what these ratios govern at the system level. 3, 6, 9 are not numbers in isolation. They are organizing frequencies. Frequencies in the sense that they represent rates of recurrence, points where systems return, intervals where correction occurs. And correction is not intervention. Correction is the automatic restoration of baseline when deviation is detected. Tesla observed that systems oscillate. That oscillation is not disorder. Oscillation is the movement between states, and movement between states is necessary for work, for energy conversion, for output. But oscillation that does not return to baseline drifts. It carries deviation forward. It amplifies error with each cycle. And amplified error is what produces chaos, what produces the sensation that the system is out of control. But the system is not out of control. The system is operating without checkpoints, without positions where deviation is measured and corrected. And 3, 6, 9 are those positions. 3 is where the pattern establishes. 6 is where forces equalize. 9 is where the cycle resets. And reset is what prevents drift from compounding into collapse. 3 is the first checkpoint. It is the point where a system can detect that it is deviating. 1 iteration provides no reference. 2 iterations establish direction, but not pattern. 3 iterations confirm that the direction is stable, that it will repeat unless corrected. And correction at 3 is minimal. The deviation is small. The adjustment required is small. But correction delayed past 3 becomes correction at 6, and correction at 6 requires more energy, because the deviation has compounded through 3 additional cycles, and if correction does not occur at 6, the deviation compounds through 9, and correction at 9 is total. It is not adjustment, It is reset. It is the forced return to baseline, because the accumulated deviation is too large to be corrected incrementally. And forced reset is disruptive. It is what most people experience as breakdown, as the moment when everything stops working. But nothing is broken. The system is correcting, and correction at 9 is always more disruptive than correction at 3, because the deviation allowed to reach 9 was ignored at 3 and 6. 6 is the balance point. It is not the midpoint. It is the point where opposing forces find proportion, where expansion and contraction equalize, where input and output balance over the cycle, and balance at 6 is dynamic. It is not static equilibrium. Static equilibrium is death. It is the absence of movement. 6 is the ratio where movement continues but does not destabilize, where forces remain active but do not dominate, where tension is present but does not produce rupture. And rupture is what occurs when 6 is violated, when one force grows beyond proportion, when extraction exceeds contribution, when demand outpaces regeneration, and imbalance at 6 does not remain at 6. Imbalance at 6 extends toward 9, and if 9 does not reset the imbalance carries forward into the next cycle, and carried imbalance is inherited instability, and inherited instability compounds, and compounded instability is what produces the failures that feel sudden, but were building across cycles that never completed. 9 is completion, but completion is not ending. Completion is the return to coherence. It is the point where accumulated deviation must be eliminated or carried forward, and elimination at 9 is automatic in systems designed with correct proportion. The system reaches 9 and resets, not through external intervention, through structure, through the recognition that 9 is the last position where reset is possible before the cycle extends into instability. And extension past 9 is continuation without integration. It is growth without consolidation. It is accumulation without completion. And accumulation without completion is congestion. It is energy trapped in incomplete patterns. Energy that cannot be released because the cycle never closed. Energy that cannot be reused because it was never returned to baseline. And energy that cannot be reused becomes unavailable. And unavailable energy is depletion. Not physical depletion, though that follows, structural depletion. The progressive loss of capacity because capacity is being consumed by maintaining incomplete cycles rather than freed through completed ones. How many cycles do you initiate that never reach completion? This is not a question of productivity. This is a question of structure. If the cycles you begin do not reach 9, the energy invested does not return to baseline. It remains bound in unfinished patterns, bound in unresolved tension, bound in structures that were initiated but never integrated. And bound energy is not neutral. Bound energy produces drag. It produces resistance. It produces the sensation that forward movement requires increasing effort, but the effort is not moving you forward. The effort is compensating for the drag created by incomplete cycles. And compensation is not progress. Compensation is maintenance. It is the energy required to prevent collapse. And energy spent preventing collapse is energy not available for growth. And growth without available energy is impossible. Not difficult, impossible. Because growth requires surplus. And surplus is what remains after maintenance. And if maintenance consumes everything, surplus is zero. And zero surplus is stagnation disguised as activity. Tesla designed systems that completed at 9. That did not extend past the point of integration. That reset automatically before deviation could compound into instability. An automatic reset is the only reset that functions reliably, because manual reset requires awareness, requires observation, requires intervention. And intervention is only possible when deviation is visible. But deviation is not always visible. Deviation is often invisible until it has already compounded past the point where small corrections suffice. And small corrections are the only corrections that do not disrupt function. Large corrections are catastrophic. They are the breakdowns that require complete reconstruction, that force the system offline, that eliminate function temporarily in order to restore structure permanently, and temporary elimination of function is acceptable when the alternative is permanent collapse. But permanent collapse is what occurs when 9 is ignored, when cycles extend indefinitely, when integration never happens. And integration is not optional for systems that persist. Integration is mandatory. 369 function as a self-regulating mechanism. 3 detects deviation. 6 balances forces. 9 resets baseline, and the mechanism operates whether conscious or not, whether designed intentionally or emergent naturally. Systems that honor 369 persist. Systems that violate 369 collapse. And persistence versus collapse is not moral outcome. Persistence versus collapse is mechanical outcome. It is the predictable result of structure aligning or misaligning with the proportions that allow stability. And stability is not rigidity. Stability is the capacity to absorb variation without losing coherence, to adapt to change without fragmenting, to maintain function across conditions that are never ideal, and non-ideal conditions are the only conditions that exist. Ideal is theoretical, real is variable, and variable conditions destroy systems that are optimized for ideal, but variable conditions strengthen systems that are optimized for proportion. Because proportion does not depend on conditions. Proportion depends on ratio, and ratio is internal. It is the relationship between elements within the system, and internal relationships are controllable when external conditions are not. 369 are organizing frequencies because they organize time. They divide continuous process into discrete intervals, intervals where observation is possible, where measurement is possible, where correction is possible, and correction is only possible at intervals. Continuous correction is impossible. Continuous correction is reaction. It is the attempt to adjust in real time without reference to baseline, and adjustment without baseline is drift. It is movement without direction. It is change without purpose, and purposeless change is chaos. But change at 369 is not chaos. Change at 369 is structured. It is the deliberate return to proportion after deviation has been detected, and detection requires interval, requires a point where the system pauses long enough to compare current state to intended state, and comparison is what reveals deviation, and deviation revealed is deviation that can be corrected. But deviation not revealed is deviation that compounds. And compounded deviation is what produces the catastrophic failures that appear random but were mathematically certain. 9 is the last opportunity for voluntary correction. Past 9, correction is forced. It is no longer a choice. It is a necessity imposed by the system's incapacity to sustain further deviation. And forced correction is always more disruptive than voluntary correction. Because forced correction occurs after the structure has already degraded, after the relationships between elements have already distorted, after the system has already adapted to dysfunction, and adaptation to dysfunction is normalization of misalignment. It is the state where incorrect proportion feels correct because it has been sustained long enough to become familiar. And familiar is not the same as functional. Familiar is simply repeated, and repetition does not validate structure. Repetition amplifies structure, and amplified dysfunction is catastrophic dysfunction. And catastrophic dysfunction is what occurs when 9 is repeatedly ignored, when cycles extend past integration, when reset never happens. And reset that never happens is drift that never stops. And drift that never stops is collapse that is only delayed. Tesla's machines honored 9. They completed cycles fully. They did not extend operation past the point where efficiency degraded. They did not continue oscillation past the point where return to baseline was possible. They stopped, they reset, they began the next cycle from coherence rather than from the degraded endpoint of the previous cycle. And beginning from coherence is what allows repetition without degradation, what allows the system to operate indefinitely, what allows output to remain stable across time. And stable output across time is reliability. And reliability is the only metric that matters for systems intended to persist, because unreliable systems do not persist. Unreliable systems fail. And failure is not random. Failure is the predictable outcome of operating outside the proportions that 369 define. At this point, the structure has revealed itself. What remains unexplained is why these proportions prevent collapse where others guarantee it. 369 are checkpoints where systems correct or drift. Harmony is not agreement. Harmony is proportion maintained across elements that remain in tension. Music demonstrates this clearly. Notes that are harmonious are not identical. They are proportional. Their frequencies relate to each other through specific ratios, and the ratios that produce harmony are mathematical. They are not subjective. They are not cultural. They are structural properties of how waves interact. When frequencies align at correct ratios, they reinforce. When frequencies misalign, they cancel. And reinforcement versus cancellation is the difference between signal and noise, between coherence and interference, between systems that amplify output and systems that consume input without producing work. Tesla recognized that the same principle governs all systems, not just acoustic systems, all systems, electrical systems, mechanical systems, biological systems, economic systems, any system where multiple forces interact, and interaction either produces harmony or produces discord, and harmony is always proportional, and the proportions that produce harmony are always related to 369. 369 govern harmony because they represent the minimum structural complexity required for forces to interact without destroying each other. 3 allows forces to establish relationship, to detect whether they are aligned or opposed, to recognize pattern in their interaction. 6 allows forces to find the ratio where neither dominates, where both remain active but proportional, where tension is present but sustainable. 9 allows forces to complete their interaction and return to baseline, to release accumulated tension, to reset the relationship so the next interaction can begin without inheriting instability from the last. And this is not theory. This is observable in every system that persists, in bridges that distribute load without fracturing, in ecosystems that balance predation and reproduction, in economies that balance production and consumption. And balance is not equality. Balance is proportion. It is the recognition that unequal forces can produce stable outcomes when the ratio is correct. And correct ratio is what 369 describes. Misalignment produces waste, not minor inefficiency, structural waste, waste that compounds with every cycle. When proportion is incorrect, energy that should convert to work converts to heat instead. And heat is not just warmth. Heat is disorder. It is energy dispersed in ways that cannot be recovered, that cannot be redirected toward output, that cannot be reused in subsequent cycles. And energy that cannot be reused is energy lost, and lost energy is capacity diminished. And diminished capacity is the progressive reduction in what the system can produce, not because the system is aging, because the system is operating at proportions that guarantee degradation. And degradation is not wear. Degradation is the accumulated result of operating outside ratios that allow sustainability. And sustainability is not endurance. Sustainability is the capacity to function indefinitely without external support. And external support is not assistance. External support is dependency. And dependency is fragility. Tesla observed that circuits operating at harmonic frequencies required less current to produce the same output. That resistance decreased. That efficiency increased. That the system self-regulated without requiring external dampening or amplification. And self-regulation is the hallmark of correct proportion. Systems that are proportional do not require constant adjustment. They adjust themselves. They detect deviation and correct automatically, not through intelligence, through structure, through the fact that deviation from proportion produces feedback that the system cannot ignore. And feedback is experienced as resistance, as friction, as heat, and heat is pain, not emotional pain, mechanical pain, the signal that the system is operating outside optimal range. And optimal range is not comfortable range. Optimal range is the range where input converts to output with minimum waste, where effort translates to result, where energy applied produces work rather than heat. Why do most systems degrade over time? Not because time causes degradation, because proportion is not maintained over time, because small deviations are ignored, because correction is delayed, because the belief persists that the system will self-correct without intervention. But self-correction is not automatic in all systems. Self-correction is automatic only in systems designed with checkpoints, with positions where deviation is measured and corrected, and the positions are 3, 6, 9, and systems without these checkpoints do not self-correct. They drift, and drift is directional, and the direction is always toward increased disorder, toward increased waste, toward increased resistance, until resistance is so high that function becomes impossible. And impossibility is not failure of effort. Impossibility is failure of structure, and structure fails when proportion is violated long enough for the violation to become normalized, for incorrect ratio to feel correct, for misalignment to feel like alignment. Proportion is not visible through casual observation. Proportion is visible through measurement, through comparison of actual ratio to optimal ratio. And optimal ratio is 3, 6, 9. Not in every instance, but in every instance where stability is required, where repetition without degradation is necessary, where the system must persist across conditions that vary, and varying conditions destroy systems optimized for static conditions. But varying conditions strengthen systems optimized for proportion, because proportion is internal. It is the relationship between elements within the system, and internal relationships can be maintained when external conditions cannot be controlled, and external conditions can never be controlled. External conditions vary, and variation is not the problem. Variation is reality. The problem is systems that cannot adapt to variation, systems that function only when conditions are ideal. And ideal conditions are rare. Real conditions are variable, and variable conditions expose structural weakness immediately. And structural weakness is always proportional weakness. It is always the result of ratios that were close but not exact, functional but not optimal, adequate for short duration but insufficient for sustained operation. Tesla's inventions functioned across temperature variations, across load changes, across environmental interference, because the proportions were exact, because the ratios between components were not approximate, they were precise, and precision at the structural level produces reliability at the operational level. And reliability is not luck. Reliability is mathematics. It is the predictable outcome of proportion maintained, of ratios that do not drift, of relationships that remain stable even when individual elements degrade. And individual elements always degrade. Materials fatigue, connections weaken, surfaces corrode. But systems designed with correct proportion continue to function even as individual components degrade. Because the proportion is structural, it is distributed across the system, and distributed proportion is resilient. It does not depend on any single element remaining perfect. It depends on the relationship between elements remaining proportional, and proportional relationships are maintained through 3, 6, 9, 3 where deviation is detected, 6 where forces rebalance, 9 where the system resets. Harmony is achieved not by eliminating tension, but by proportioning tension. Tension is necessary. Tension is what produces work. Tension is the difference in potential that allows energy to flow. Without tension, there is no gradient. Without gradient, there is no flow. Without flow, there is no work. So tension is not the enemy. Misaligned tension is the enemy. Tension that does not resolve into proportion. Tension that accumulates without releasing. Tension that compounds across cycles without integration. And accumulated tension is pressure. And pressure, when unrelieved, produces rupture. And rupture is catastrophic release. It is the sudden failure that appears random but was building incrementally across every cycle that did not reach 9, that did not reset, that did not return to baseline. And baseline is not rest. Baseline is the configuration from which the next cycle can begin without inheriting the pressure of the last. 3, 6, 9 prevent collapse because they prevent accumulation. They ensure that deviation is corrected before it compounds, that tension is released before it ruptures, that cycles complete before they extend into instability. And completion is not optional for systems designed to persist. Completion is mandatory, and mandatory completion is what 369 enforces, not through external regulation, through internal structure, through the recognition that systems organized around these proportions cannot extend past 9. They reach 9 and reset automatically, not because they are programmed, because the structure leaves no other option. And structure that leaves no other option is structure that is reliable, that produces predictable outcomes, that allows design rather than hope. And design is what separates systems that function from systems that fail. Systems that function are designed around proportion. Systems that fail are assembled around proximity, and proximity is not proportion. Proximity is coincidence, and coincidence is not structure, and structure is everything. Proportion maintained is harmony sustained. Proportion violated is discord amplified, and amplification occurs through time, through repetition, through cycles that repeat the same misalignment until the misalignment becomes the structure. And misalignment as structure is permanent dysfunction. It is the state where the system can no longer function correctly, even if the misalignment is removed, because the system has adapted to the misalignment, has built compensations around it, has normalized it. And normalization of dysfunction is why most systems do not recover. They do not recover because recovery would require dismantling the compensations, would require removing the adaptations, would require returning to proportion, and return to proportion feels like loss to a system that has adapted to dysfunction, feels like collapse, feels like the destruction of what was built. But what was built was never stable. What was built was held together by compensation, and compensation is not structure. Compensation is force, and force depletes. Why these proportions prevent collapse where others guarantee it is now visible. These proportions are the only proportions that allow deviation to be corrected before it compounds into instability that cannot be reversed. Harmony is proportion maintained across forces that remain in tension. The key was never hidden. The key is visible in every system that organizes naturally, in the spirals of shells, in the branching of trees, in the orbits of planets, in the crystallization of minerals, in the resonance of atoms. The pattern repeats because the pattern is structural. It is not imposed from outside. It is not the result of conscious design in natural systems. It is the inevitable outcome of forces seeking stable configuration, and stable configuration is always proportional, and the proportions that appear most consistently are 3, 6, 9, not as decoration, as foundation, as the ratios that allow complexity to emerge from simplicity without collapsing into chaos. Tesla did not discover this. Tesla recognized this, and recognition is not creation. Recognition is observation of what was always present but obscured by the belief that complexity requires complex explanation. But complexity does not require complex explanation. Complexity requires precise explanation, and precision is what 369 provides. 369 is not the answer to every question. 369 is the framework within which stable systems operate. It is the recognition that initiation, balance, and completion are not sequential stages, but interdependent conditions. That all three must be present for a system to function without degrading. That absence of any one produces specific forms of failure. Absence of three produces systems that cannot detect deviation, that cannot recognize when they are drifting, that cannot self-correct because they have no reference for what correct means. Absence of 6 produces systems that cannot balance forces, that oscillate between extremes, that consume energy without producing stable output. Absence of 9 produces systems that cannot complete, that accumulate without integrating, that extend indefinitely without resetting. and extension without reset is continuation without correction, and continuation without correction is drift, and drift is directional, and the direction is always toward collapse. The key is not 369 as numbers. The key is 369 as positions, as checkpoints in cycles, as moments where the system can observe itself and adjust. An adjustment at checkpoints is minimal. It is correction applied early when deviation is small, but adjustment delayed past checkpoints becomes reconstruction. It becomes correction applied late when deviation has compounded, and late correction is always more disruptive than early correction, because late correction requires that the system be taken offline, that function be suspended temporarily to restore structure permanently, and suspension of function is acceptable when the alternative is permanent collapse. But permanent collapse is what occurs when checkpoints are ignored, when 3 is passed without recognition, when 6 is violated without rebalancing, when 9 is exceeded without reset, and exceeded 9 is the point of no return. It is the threshold past which voluntary correction is no longer possible, where forced correction becomes mandatory. Tesla's understanding was not mystical because it was not interpretive. He did not assign meaning to the numbers. He observed behavior in systems and recognized that the behavior followed patterns, that the patterns were proportional, that the proportions could be expressed numerically. And numerical expression is not symbolism. Numerical expression is measurement. It is the quantification of relationship, the translation of ratio into number, so that ratio can be replicated, so that systems can be designed rather than discovered, so that outcomes can be predicted rather than hoped for. And prediction is not fortune-telling. Prediction is the recognition that if structure is known and proportion is maintained, outcome is determined, not fixed, but constrained. Constrained to ranges that are known, that are testable, that are repeatable, and repeatability is the only proof that matters, because repeatability is law, and law is what governs outcome regardless of belief. The forbidden aspect of 369 is not that the knowledge was suppressed. The forbidden aspect is that the knowledge demands structural honesty. It demands that you observe where your systems are failing and acknowledge that the failure is proportional, that the failure is not circumstantial, that the failure is the result of operating outside ratios that allow stability. An acknowledgement of structural failure is difficult because structural failure implies that the problem is not external, the problem is internal. The problem is not that conditions are unfavorable. The problem is that the structure cannot function in real conditions, that it was optimized for ideal conditions that do not exist, that it requires constant support to prevent collapse. And constant support is not stability. Constant support is dependency, and dependency is not sustainable. Dependency is temporary, and temporary always ends. And when temporary ends, what remains is structure. And if the structure is unsound, collapse is immediate. How many systems in your life require constant intervention to prevent collapse? This is not a question of effort. This is a question of structure. If the system requires constant adjustment, the system is not stable. The system is being held together by force, by compensation, by continuous correction of deviation that should have been prevented by proportion. And prevention through proportion is the only prevention that does not deplete, because prevention through proportion is automatic. It is self-regulating. It does not require awareness. It does not require effort. It requires only that the initial ratio be correct. And correct ratio is 369. 3 where pattern establishes, 6 where forces balance, 9 where cycle completes. And completion is not ending. Completion is integration. It is the return to baseline so that the next cycle can begin without inheriting instability. And cycles that do not inherit instability can repeat indefinitely. And indefinite repetition is persistence. And persistence is the only outcome worth designing for. The key to everything is not a secret technique. The key to everything is structural alignment. Alignment with proportions that allow systems to organize naturally, that allow deviation to be corrected automatically, that allow cycles to complete fully, and full completion is what most systems never achieve. Most systems initiate, Many systems balance temporarily, few systems complete, and incomplete systems do not fail immediately. Incomplete systems degrade gradually. They lose efficiency over time. They require increasing input to maintain constant output. They accumulate instability across cycles until the instability is too large to sustain, and unsustainable systems collapse. Not because they were poorly constructed initially, because they were never designed to complete. They were designed to function, but function without completion is temporary function. It is operation that cannot persist, that cannot scale, that cannot adapt. And adaptation is not optional. Conditions change, and systems that cannot adapt to changing conditions do not persist. They become obsolete. And obsolescence is not failure of the system. Obsolescence is failure of the structure to account for variation. 369 account for variation by providing checkpoints. By creating positions where the system can detect that conditions have changed and adjust proportion accordingly. And adjustment of proportion is not adjustment of goal. Adjustment of proportion is adjustment of method. The goal remains constant. The outcome remains constant. But the ratio between elements changes to maintain alignment with current conditions rather than past conditions. And current conditions are the only conditions that matter. Past conditions are irrelevant. Future conditions are unpredictable. Current conditions are measurable, and measurable conditions allow precise adjustment. And precise adjustment at 369 is what prevents drift, what prevents degradation, what prevents the slow accumulation of instability that most people experience as aging, as decline, as the inevitable progression toward dysfunction. But dysfunction is not inevitable. Dysfunction is the result of operating without checkpoints, without positions where deviation is measured and corrected. And measurement and correction are what 369 provide. The key was never hidden, because the key is observable. It is present in every system that persists, in every structure that functions across time, in every cycle that repeats without degrading. The key is proportion, and proportion is 369, not as mysticism, as mechanics, as the ratios that allow initiation without chaos, that allow balance without stagnation, that allow completion without collapse. And these are not rare conditions. These are the conditions under which all stable systems operate. Systems that are stable do not become stable through luck. They become stable through structure. And structure is always proportional. And proportion is always numerical. And the numbers that govern stability are 369. Not because 369 are special, because 369 are structural. They are the minimum complexity required for a system to self-organize, to self-correct, to self-sustain. And self-sustaining systems are the only systems that persist. And persistence is not survival. Persistence is the capacity to function indefinitely without degrading. And indefinite function is what 369 makes possible. Tesla understood this completely. He did not theorize. He observed. He measured. He adjusted. And adjustment based on measurement is precision. And precision is what separates systems that function from systems that fail. Systems that function are designed around observable proportion. Systems that fail are assembled around unexamined assumption. And assumption is not structure. Assumption is hope. And hope is not design. Hope is the absence of design. And absence of design is randomness. And randomness does not produce stable outcomes. Randomness produces variation. And variation without structure is chaos. And chaos does not organize. Chaos disperses. And dispersion is the opposite of integration. And integration is what 9 provides. And 9 is what most systems never reach. And systems that never reach 9 never complete. And systems that never complete never stabilize. And systems that never stabilize eventually collapse. Not through external pressure, through internal accumulation of deviation that was never corrected because the checkpoints were never honored. The key to everything is the recognition that structure determines outcome, that proportion determines structure, that 369 determines proportion, not through belief, through mechanics, through the observable, testable, repeatable fact that systems organized around these ratios persist and systems organized outside these ratios collapse. And persistence versus collapse is not moral outcome. Persistence versus collapse is mechanical outcome. It is the predictable result of alignment or misalignment with proportions that allow stability. And stability is not stasis. Stability is the capacity to function across variation, to adapt without fragmenting, to persist without degrading. And persistence without degradation is what 369 makes inevitable. Structure governs outcome. Proportion governs structure. 369 governs proportion.